It happened on a late spring evening in Washington, D.C., when the city's elite gathered under crystal chandeliers and the weight of political legacy. No one expected that night to become the origin of a story that would ripple through two of America's most scrutinized families. Barack Obama, the former president known for his measured words and protective instincts, found himself face to face with Barron Trump, the youngest son of his political successor, and what transpired in those few minutes would challenge everything the public thought they knew about restraint, family, and the unspoken rules that govern power. The warning Obama delivered was direct, almost cold in its clarity. Stay away from Sasha. But it wasn't the warning itself that stunned those who later learned of it. It was Barron's reaction, a response so unexpected, so layered with defiance and vulnerability, that it forced everyone to reconsider the quiet young man who had grown up in the shadow of the White House. The evening began like any other high-profile charity gala. The Kennedy Center glittered with the kind of carefully curated elegance that Washington does best: string quartets, champagne towers, and conversations that danced between small talk and geopolitical strategy. Sasha Obama had arrived with her father, radiant in a midnight blue gown that caught the light with every step. She had grown into a poised young woman, navigating her 20s with the grace of someone who understood the burden of a famous name but refused to be defined by it alone. Across the room, Barron Trump stood near a marble column, tall and enigmatic, his presence commanding attention despite his preference for silence. At 6'9", he was impossible to miss, yet he had mastered the art of existing in plain sight, observing, rarely engaging, always calculating. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't the first time. What the public didn't know, what had been carefully hidden behind Secret Service protocols and family discretion, was that Sasha and Barron had been communicating for months. It started, innocuously enough, a shared joke at a bipartisan youth summit, a follow on social media, late-night text messages that evolved from political banter to something far more personal. They were two people born into circumstances neither had chosen, raised under microscopes, expected to carry legacies they never asked for. In each other, they found something rare: understanding without judgment, curiosity without agenda. But their connection existed in a vacuum, isolated from the reality that their families represented opposing forces in American history. And on this particular night, that reality was about to collide with the fragile world they had built in secret. Barack Obama noticed the glance. A father's instinct is a powerful thing, sharpened by years of political awareness and the protective impulse that comes with raising daughters in the public eye. He watched as Barron moved through the crowd, his trajectory unmistakable. Obama's jaw tightened. He excused himself from a conversation with a senator and intercepted Barron near the terrace doors. Away from the cameras and curious eyes, the exchange was brief, lasting no more than 3 minutes. But those who witnessed it from a distance described the former president's posture as firm, his expression unreadable. Barron stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, listening. When Obama finished speaking, the silence stretched unbearably. Then Barron did something no one anticipated. He didn't retreat, he didn't nod in compliance. Instead, he looked Obama directly in the eye and spoke calmly, deliberately, with the kind of quiet intensity that commanded respect, even in defiance. No one heard the exact words Barron said. But Obama's reaction was visible, a flicker of surprise, followed by something that might have been reluctant admiration. The young man turned and walked away, not in anger, but with purpose. Sasha, watching from across the room, felt her heart hammering in her chest. She had spent her entire life trusting her father's judgment, but now she stood at the edge of a choice that felt entirely her own. The night ended without incident, but beneath the surface, fault lines had been drawn. Two families, two legacies, and two young people caught in the crossfire of a story they never asked to be part of. What would Barron do next? And more importantly, what had he said that left even Barack Obama momentarily speechless? The words Barron Trump spoke to Barack Obama that night were not loud, but they carried the weight of something irreversible. "With all due respect, sir, you don't get to decide who I care about." It was a statement delivered without arrogance, without the entitlement one might expect from someone born into wealth and power. Instead, it was something far more disarming: honesty wrapped in quiet defiance. Obama had faced down dictators, negotiated with adversaries, and stared into cameras with the gravity of a nation on his shoulders. But in that moment, confronted by a 19-year-old who refused to blink, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Barron didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded, a gesture that could have been respect or finality, and walked away, leaving the former president to process what had just transpired. Sasha Obama watched from across the terrace, her pulse racing. She had grown up in the White House, learned to navigate the impossible balance between privacy and scrutiny, and built a life that was her own despite the constant attention. At 24, she was a woman who knew her mind, pursuing her passions with the same determination her parents had taught her. But this connection with Barron was uncharted territory. She had never expected it, never planned for it. Yet, over the past few months, their late-night conversations had become the part of her day she looked forward to most. They talked about everything: the absurdity of growing up under Secret Service protection, the loneliness of being recognized everywhere but understood nowhere, the pressure of living up to legacies they didn't create. With Barron, she didn't have to be Sasha Obama, daughter of the first black president. She could just be Sasha. And that freedom was intoxicating. But now her father had intervened, and she felt the familiar tension between loyalty and autonomy tightening in her chest. Barack Obama was protective, fiercely so, and she understood why. He had spent 8 years shielding his daughters from the worst of the political storm, ensuring they could have something resembling a normal childhood despite the circumstances. He had always been her hero, her anchor, the man who taught her to think critically and stand firm in her values. But he was also human, shaped by his own experiences and biases. And right now, those biases were colliding with her choices. Sasha excused herself from the gala, slipping through a side exit where the Secret Service detail followed at a discreet distance. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A message from Barron. "I'm sorry if I made things difficult. That wasn't my intention." She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Barron Trump sat alone in his car, parked in a quiet corner of the parking garage beneath the Kennedy Center. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he replayed the conversation with Obama in his mind. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, dismissed as a silent figure in the background of his father's chaotic presidency. The media had speculated endlessly about him: his height, his demeanor, his absence from public events. But they never saw what mattered: that he was paying attention. Always watching, always learning. He had seen how political families consumed their children, how expectations became cages, how love could be weaponized in the name of protection. And he had vowed never to become a pawn in someone else's game. Sasha was different. She didn't see him as a Trump, she saw him as Barron, and that simple distinction meant everything. His phone lit up with her response: "Don't apologize. Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by apprehension. What came next would require more than defiance. It would require courage, strategy, and a willingness to face consequences neither of them could fully predict. Inside the Kennedy Center, Barack Obama rejoined Michelle, who immediately sensed the tension radiating from him. She touched his arm gently, a silent question. He shook his head, not ready to explain. But she knew. She always knew. And in that moment, both parents realized they were facing something they hadn't anticipated: their daughter making a choice that would force them to confront their own fears about legacy, loyalty, and letting go. What would Sasha say when they finally met? And could Barron prepare for the storm that was inevitably coming? They met at dawn in Rock Creek Park, far from the gleaming monuments and camera lenses that defined their lives. Sasha Obama arrived first, wrapped in a gray hoodie, her breath visible in the early morning chill. The Secret Service detail had been reduced, now that she was in her 20s. But old habits died. Archie had learned long ago how to slip away for moments of solitude. Barron appeared minutes later, emerging from the fog-draped trail like a figure from another era. At 6'9", he should have been impossible to miss, yet he moved with a quietness that defied his size. They stood facing each other for a long moment, the weight of the previous night hanging between them like something tangible. Then Sasha spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Tell me what my father said to you." Barron didn't flinch. He had expected this. "He told me that our families have a complicated history, that you've been through enough scrutiny without adding more, that I should consider what being seen with me would do to your reputation." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. He wasn't wrong about any of it. Sasha felt anger flare in her chest, not at Barron, but at the familiar cage of protection that had surrounded her entire life. She loved her father fiercely, understood his instinct to shield her from harm. Michelle had been the same way, turning playdates into security operations, transforming simple teenage experiences into logistical nightmares. Growing up with armed guards, background checks, and constant surveillance had taught Sasha to be careful, strategic, always aware of the ripple effects of her choices. But it had also taught her something else, that living without risk meant never truly living at all. "My father doesn't get to decide this," she said, echoing the sentiment Barron had expressed the night before. "Neither does mine," Barron replied quietly. "But we'd be lying if we said their opinions don't matter." It was the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Donald Trump and Barack Obama represented opposing visions of America, their legacies locked in a bitter rivalry that had defined a decade of political warfare. The animosity between them wasn't just policy, it was personal, rooted in years of public attacks, conspiracy theories, and mutual disdain. And now their children stood in the middle of that battlefield, attempting to carve out something that belonged only to them. It was audacious. Maybe even impossible. But the very impossibility of it made Sasha want it more. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. My parents taught me to date widely, to not settle, to know my worth before I let anyone into my life. She was thinking of the conversations she'd had with Michelle and Barack, their advice grounded in their own experiences of trial and error. And I've listened. I've dated. I've learned what I don't want. Her eyes locked onto his, with an intensity that made the world around them fade. But when I talk to you, Barron, I don't feel like I'm performing. I don't feel like I'm living up to a legacy or managing an image. I just feel like myself. The vulnerability in her voice was undeniable, and it cracked something open in Barron that he hadn't realized was sealed shut. He reached out, not touching her, but letting his hand hover in the space between them, a gesture of possibility rather than possession. My whole life, people have assumed they know who I am because of my last name, he said. They see Trump and they think they understand everything about me. But you never did that. You asked questions. You listened. His voice wavered for the first time. You made me believe that maybe I could be more than the tallest shadow in the room. The words hung in the cold morning air, raw and honest. Sasha reached up and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a declaration that transcended politics, family legacies, and the weight of history. But as they stood there, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a distance, partially obscured by the trees. Someone who would make sure this secret didn't stay hidden for long. The photograph appeared online 72 hours later. Grainy but unmistakable, two figures holding hands in the dawn light of Rock Creek Park. Their faces partially obscured, but their identities clear to anyone who knew what to look for. Within minutes, it had been shared thousands of times. Within an hour, it was trending on every major platform. By noon, cable news networks were dissecting it frame by frame. Political commentators were spinning narratives, and both the Trump and Obama camps were scrambling to control a story that had already spiraled beyond containment. The headline that dominated the news cycle was simple and incendiary. Barron Trump and Sasha Obama, a secret romance that could shatter two legacies. Donald Trump's reaction was immediate and explosive. At Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by advisors who had learned to navigate his moods like soldiers crossing a minefield, he stared at the image on his phone with an expression that cycled through disbelief, fury, and something darker, betrayal. This cannot be real, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Barron had always been the quietest of his children, the one who stayed out of the spotlight, who seemed to exist in a parallel universe removed from the chaos of Trump politics. But this was a direct challenge to everything the Trump brand represented. Barack Obama wasn't just a political opponent. He was the man Trump had spent years undermining, questioning his legitimacy, attacking his policies. And now his son was involved with Obama's daughter. It felt like cosmic mockery. Across the country, in the serene privacy of their Washington home, Barack and Michelle Obama sat in tense silence. Michelle's hands were trembling as she read the headlines, her mind racing back to the fears she had articulated years earlier, the terror that Trump's rhetoric had put her family in danger, that unstable minds might target her daughters. She had never forgiven Trump for the birther conspiracy, for the recklessness that had made her feel like her children were living under a permanent threat, and now Sasha had chosen to get close to a Trump. The betrayal felt visceral, personal, like a wound reopening. Barack placed a hand on her shoulder, but she pulled away. How could she? Michelle whispered, her voice breaking. After everything we taught her. After everything we've been through. Barack's response was more measured. But beneath the calm exterior, he was wrestling with his own turmoil. He had warned Barron to stay away, had made his position clear. Yet the young man had defied him, and where Sasha had sided with that defiance. He thought about the conversation at the gala, the way Barron had looked him in the eye without flinching. There had been something in that moment, a glimmer of respect mixed with resolve, that had unsettled him. Barack had always believed in dialogue, in finding common ground even with adversaries. But this felt different. This was family. And family was the line he had always sworn to protect at any cost. Political polarization was one thing. It affected policies, elections, legacies. But when it invaded the home, when it turned parent against child, the damage became irreparable. Sasha's phone had been ringing nonstop. Messages from friends, reporters, strangers, everyone wanted a piece of the story. But there was only one call she needed to make. She dialed Barron, her hands shaking. He answered on the first ring. Are you okay? His voice was tight with concern. No, she admitted, but we knew this could happen. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of consequences they had underestimated. My father wants to see me, Barron said finally. So does mine, Sasha replied. They both understood what that meant. Separate interrogations, separate demands, separate ultimatums. The world was demanding they choose sides: family loyalty or personal truth, and neither option felt like winning. That evening, as the sun set over a nation captivated by scandal, Two young people prepared to face the judgment of the most powerful families in America. Barron stood before a mirror in Mar-a-Lago, straightening his tie, rehearsing words that felt inadequate. Sasha sat on the edge of her bed in Washington, staring at a photograph of her parents from happier times, wondering if love could survive the collision of legacy and choice. Both of them knew that what came next would determine not just their futures, but whether reconciliation was even possible when politics became personal. The reckoning was about to begin. The confrontation at the Obama residence happened first. Sasha sat across from her parents in the living room, where she had spent countless evenings as a child, where family game nights and quiet conversations had shaped who she was. But tonight, the warmth felt absent, replaced by a tension so thick it made breathing difficult. Michelle spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion she could barely contain. "Do you understand what this looks like, what it does to us?" Sasha met her mother's gaze without flinching. "I understand that you're hurt. I understand that this complicates things. But I also understand that I'm 24 years old, and I get to decide who matters to me." Barack leaned forward, his expression measured but pained. "This isn't about control, Sasha. It's about consequence. The Trumps represent everything we've fought against. Barron isn't his father," Sasha interrupted, her voice rising. "Just like I'm not you." The words landed like a physical blow. Barack Obama had spent his presidency teaching his daughters about values, forgiveness, grace, the importance of rising above hatred, even when it was directed at you. He had preached that people were more than their worst moments, that understanding replaced judgment was the path forward. But now, faced with his daughter's choice, those principles felt abstract, theoretical, impossible to practice when it involved his own family. Michelle's eyes filled with tears. "After everything Trump said about us, about your father, about me, how can you look at one of them and see anything but that pain?" Sasha's voice softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Because Barron looked at me and saw Sasha, not a symbol. He listened when I spoke about my dreams, my fears, my frustrations. He didn't use me to make a point or win an argument. He just saw me." She paused, her own eyes glistening. "Isn't that what you always taught me to look for? Someone who sees me for who I am." Simultaneously, in Mar-a-Lago, Barron Trump stood before his father in the gilded study that smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Donald Trump paced like a caged animal, his anger palpable but mixed with something else, confusion, perhaps even hurt. "Of all the women in the world, you choose an Obama. You're smarter than this, Barron." But Barron had spent 19 years observing, learning when to speak and when to stay silent. He had watched his siblings navigate their father's expectations, seen how loyalty was rewarded and deviation punished. Yet something inside him, something that had crystallized during those dawn conversations with Sasha, refused to bend. "I'm not choosing her to hurt you," Barron said quietly. "I'm choosing her because she makes me believe I can be someone worth knowing beyond this name." Trump stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "This family has given you everything." "I know," Barron replied, "and I'm grateful. But everything you've given me has also been a weight I didn't ask to carry." His voice remained steady, respectful but unyielding. "Sasha understands that. She's lived it too, and maybe that's exactly why this matters, because we both know what it's like to be defined by something we didn't choose. And with each other, we get to just be ourselves." The honesty in his son's voice seemed to catch Trump off guard. For a moment, the bluster faded, revealing something vulnerable underneath. He looked at Barron, really looked at him, and, perhaps for the first time, saw not an extension of himself, but a young man trying to forge his own path. The resolution didn't come that night, or even that week. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. Michelle Obama, who had built her life on the principle that grace was stronger than grievance, found herself remembering the advice she had given her daughters about relationships: that they should date widely, learn deeply, and never settle for someone who diminished them. And if Barron Trump made her daughter feel seen, valued, and respected, could she deny that because of his last name? Barack wrestled with his own teachings about forgiveness and understanding, realizing that political polarization had real consequences when it turned families into battlegrounds. If reconciliation was possible in the public sphere, shouldn't it begin in private? Donald Trump, never one for introspection, surprised everyone when he told reporters weeks later, "Look, I don't agree with Obama on anything, but my son, he's his own man. And maybe that's exactly what I raised him to be." The story that shocked America wasn't just the warning or the defiance, it was the quiet revolution that followed. Two families, representing opposite ends of the political spectrum, choosing relationship over rhetoric. Sasha and Barron didn't become a public couple overnight. They moved carefully, deliberately, building something real, away from cameras and commentary. But their choice became a symbol of something desperately needed: the radical idea that people could be more than their politics, that connection could survive division, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was love someone the world told you was impossible. In the end, Barron Trump's shocking reaction wasn't anger or submission, it was the courage to choose authenticity over expectation. And in that choice, he reminded everyone watching that the future doesn't have to repeat the conflicts of the past.